Margaret Stevens had barely finished her morning coffee when her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda. Estate sale starts at 8 a.m. sharp. Everything must go today. The message felt like a punch to the stomach. 3 weeks had passed since Grandma Dorothy's funeral, and already the family was dismantling the Victorian home that had sheltered 4 generations of memories. Margaret stared at the message, remembering how she'd begged her siblings to wait, to think it through, to consider keeping some pieces. But Linda, always the practical one, had dismissed her sentimentality with a wave of her manicured hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. By the time Margaret arrived at the sprawling estate sale, strangers were already crawling through her grandmother's belongings like ants at a picnic. Cardboard signs with black marker prices hung from every surface. The mahogany dining set where she'd eaten countless Sunday dinners now bore a tag reading, "Table $150, chairs $25 each." The ornate mirror that had reflected 5 generations of family portraits was marked down to $75. Margaret's throat tightened as she watched a young couple debate whether the antique secretary desk was worth the $200 asking price. "Oh good, you made it," Linda called out, clipboard in hand and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved a complicated problem. "We've already sold the china cabinet and most of the bedroom furniture. That old rocking chair went first thing this morning for $40. Can you believe someone actually wanted that ratty thing?" Margaret's heart sank. That rocking chair had been Dorothy's favorite, where she'd spent her final years reading mystery novels and watching birds at the feeder outside her window. "You could have called me," Margaret said quietly. "I would have wanted it." Linda rolled her eyes. "Margaret, you live in a tiny apartment. Where would you put all this old stuff? Besides, we're splitting the money 4 ways. Your share should be around $3,000, maybe more if we sell everything." Their brothers Kevin and James appeared from the garage, both looking pleased with the morning's progress. "The tools are flying off the tables," Kevin announced, counting a wad of bills. "Dad's old workbench just sold for $200. Remember how we used to help him build those birdhouses?" "Everything's going perfectly," James added, adjusting his expensive watch. The antique dealer from downtown already bought 6 pieces. Said most of it was just typical Depression-era furniture, nothing special, but he'd take it off our hands for bulk pricing. Margaret felt her chest tighten. What antique dealer? Which pieces did he buy? "Some guy named Harrison Reed," Linda said, checking her clipboard. "He seemed to know what he was talking about. Took that ugly old armoire from the attic, the writing desk with all the scratches, and a few other pieces nobody else wanted. Paid cash, $800 for the lot." "The writing desk?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Grandma Dorothy's writing desk? She used to sit there every morning writing in her journals." "Exactly," Kevin laughed. "Who writes by hand anymore?" The thing was practically falling apart. Mr. Reed said he might be able to restore it, but honestly, we were lucky anyone took it. Margaret wandered through the house in a daze, watching strangers rifle through the remnants of her childhood. The hand-carved jewelry box where Dorothy had kept her wedding ring was being examined by a teenager who complained it was, quote, too old-fashioned. The set of silver serving spoons, tarnished but elegant, sat in a cardboard box marked, "Mixed lot minus $20. As the day wore on, Margaret felt increasingly invisible among her own family. While Linda orchestrated the sale with military precision and her brothers counted money, Margaret found herself gravitating toward the items nobody seemed to want. A small wooden music box with a broken ballerina. A stack of handwritten recipe cards held together with a rubber band. A worn leather photo album filled with pictures of relatives she barely recognized. "You're being too sentimental," Linda said, noticing Margaret's distress. "Grandma Dorothy wouldn't want us keeping all this clutter. She was always talking about how she had too much stuff, remember? We're just doing what she would have wanted." But Margaret remembered differently. She remembered Dorothy carefully dusting each piece, telling stories about where everything came from. The writing desk had belonged to Dorothy's mother, carried west in a covered wagon in 1889. The silver spoons had been a wedding gift from Dorothy's aunt, who'd worked as a seamstress to afford them. The jewelry box had been handmade by Dorothy's father during the long winter of 1932 when work was scarce. By late afternoon, the house looked like a skeleton. Bare walls showed faded rectangles where paintings had hung for decades. Empty rooms echoed with unfamiliar voices as the last buyers hauled away their bargains. Linda stood in the kitchen, dividing the cash into 4 neat piles. $3,200 each, she announced triumphantly. Not bad for a bunch of old furniture and knickknacks? Margaret stared at the money, feeling sick. Her grandmother's lifetime of treasures, reduced to a stack of 20s and 50s. What about the things that didn't sell? Goodwill pickup is scheduled for Monday, James said. Whatever's left goes to charity. Tax write-off, you know. As her siblings celebrated their successful sale, Margaret slipped away to Dorothy's old room. It was empty now except for the built-in closet and the window seat where she used to curl up with books on rainy afternoons. She sat there in the silence, trying to memorize the way the late afternoon light fell across the hardwood floors, the way the old radiator ticked and settled, the faint scent of lavender that had always clung to Dorothy's belongings. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory texts from Linda about their smart business decision, and reminders about cleaning out the last few items before Monday. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just made a terrible mistake, that in their hurry to liquidate and divide, they'd lost something far more valuable than money. She just didn't know what it was yet. 3 days after the estate sale, Margaret couldn't concentrate on anything. She'd called in sick to her job at the library, spending her time instead poring over old photo albums and trying to remember every detail about the furniture her family had so eagerly discarded. Something nagged at her, a persistent voice in the back of her mind that whispered they'd made a catastrophic error. On Thursday morning, she found herself driving through downtown, past the antique shops and galleries that lined Maple Street. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she saw the elegant gold lettering on a storefront window, Reed & Associates Fine Antiques. Her heart began to race as she parked across the street, remembering her brother's casual mention of Harrison Reed, the dealer who'd bought Dorothy's writing desk, and several other pieces for what now seemed like an insultingly small amount. The shop's interior was a maze of carefully arranged furniture, each piece illuminated by soft spotlights that made the wood grain gleam like honey. Margaret recognized several items immediately. Her grandmother's armoire, now polished to perfection and displaying delicate porcelain figurines. A price tag dangled discreetly from one corner. $4,000. "May I help you?" A distinguished man in his 60s approached, wearing a well-tailored suit and the confident smile of someone who dealt in beautiful, expensive things. "Are you Mr. Reed?" Margaret asked, her voice barely steady. "Harrison Reed, yes. Are you interested in something particular?" "That armoire just came in this week. Exceptional craftsmanship, probably 1890s based on the joinery and hardware." Margaret's mouth went dry. "That armoire belonged to my grandmother. You bought it at an estate sale on Monday for, yes. Reed's." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "The Stevens estate. Lovely pieces, though they needed considerable restoration work. Are you perhaps looking to purchase something back? I understand how difficult these transitions can be for families. How much work could it have needed?" Margaret gestured toward the pristine armoire. "It looks perfect now." Reed cleared his throat. "Well, a good cleaning, some minor wood conditioning, nothing too extensive." He seemed eager to change the subject. "Was there something specific you were hoping to find?" "The writing desk," Margaret said. "A small walnut desk with brass handles. You bought it along with some other pieces." Something flickered across Reed's face, gone so quickly Margaret almost missed it. "I'm afraid that piece has already been sold. Private collector. Very interested in American furniture from that period." Margaret's heart sank, but she pressed on. "Do you remember anything about it? My grandmother used to tell me stories about its history." Reed's laugh sounded forced. "Oh, these old family stories. Everyone thinks their furniture has some romantic past. The reality is, Most pieces from that era are fairly common, mass-produced during the furniture boom of the early 1900s. But Margaret had caught something in his tone, a dismissiveness that felt calculated. This desk came west in a covered wagon in 1889. It belonged to my great-great-grandmother. Covered wagon, Reed repeated with barely concealed condescension. Yes, well, I hear that story quite often. I'm afraid the construction techniques and materials don't support such an early date for most pieces I encounter. Margaret left the shop feeling deflated, but more suspicious than ever. Reed's dismissal of her family's history felt wrong, almost aggressive in its certainty. She spent the rest of the afternoon at the public library, researching antique furniture values and trying to understand what she might be missing. That evening, she called her elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen, who'd been Dorothy's closest friend for 30 years. I keep thinking about Grandma's furniture, Margaret confessed. The family sold everything, but something feels off about it. Oh, honey, Mrs. Chen's voice carried deep sympathy. Your grandmother was so proud of those pieces. She used to tell me about that writing desk, how her great-grandmother had carried it all the way from Pennsylvania. And that armoire, she said it was made by German craftsmen who'd settled in Wisconsin. The antique dealer said these stories were probably made up. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, your grandmother wasn't the type to embellish. She was a history teacher for 40 years. She kept meticulous records of everything, including where each piece of furniture came from. In fact, Mrs. Chen paused. She once showed me a folder full of documentation about her antiques. Old bills of sale, family letters, even photographs. She was very proud of having proof of their provenance. Margaret's pulse quickened. What kind of documentation? Papers going back generations. I remember her showing me a letter from 1923 where her aunt described moving the writing desk to a new house, and photographs of the armoire in different family homes over the decades. She said documentation was important for valuable pieces. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her apartment, staring at the $3,000 her siblings had given her as her share of the estate sale. A terrible suspicion was forming in her mind. If Dorothy had kept documentation proving the furniture's history and value, where were those papers now? The next morning, Margaret drove back to Dorothy's house. The realtor hadn't taken possession yet, and Linda had given her a key for final cleanup. The empty rooms felt haunted, but Margaret moved purposefully through them, checking every drawer, every closet, every possible hiding place where Dorothy might have kept important documents. In the basement, behind Dorothy's old sewing machine, Margaret found a metal filing cabinet they'd somehow overlooked during the sale. Her hands shook as she opened the drawers, finding them organized with the precision of someone who'd spent decades teaching high school students the importance of keeping good records. The folder labeled Furniture Family Heirlooms was thick with papers. Margaret opened it with trembling fingers and found exactly what Mrs. Chen had described. Bills of sale dating back to the 1890s. Family letters describing various pieces, and dozens of photographs showing the furniture in different settings over more than a century. But what made Margaret's knees weak was the document clipped to the front of the folder. It was an appraisal report from 2019, just 4 years old, conducted by a certified appraiser from the state capital. Margaret's eyes widened as she read the estimated values. The writing desk, classified as a rare example of Pennsylvania German craftsmanship from 1847, valued at $45,000. The armoire, identified as the work of a specific Wisconsin furniture maker whose pieces were highly sought after by collectors, appraised at $62,000. The total value of just the 6 pieces Harrison Reed had purchased for $800 was over $200,000. Margaret sank onto Dorothy's old stool, the appraisal report fluttering in her shaking hands. Her family hadn't just made a mistake, they'd been robbed. Margaret spent the weekend making copies of every document in Dorothy's folder, her anger building with each piece of evidence. The appraisal report wasn't just thorough, it was recent enough to reflect current market values, and detailed enough to prove that Harrison Reed had known exactly what he was buying. No legitimate antique dealer could have missed the craftsmanship indicators the certified appraiser had documented in precise detail. On Monday morning, she called her siblings and arranged an emergency family meeting. "I found something at Grandma's house that you all need to see," she told Linda, keeping her voice carefully neutral. More sentimental clutter? Linda sighed. Margaret, we've already moved on from this. The money's been divided. The house goes on the market next week. Just meet me at Kevin's house tonight at 7, Margaret insisted. Trust me, you'll want to see this. That evening, Margaret arrived at Kevin's suburban home carrying a manila envelope and her laptop bag. Her 3 siblings were already there, sitting around Kevin's dining room table with the resigned expressions of people humoring a relative they considered overly emotional. Okay, Margaret, James said, checking his expensive watch. What's this earth-shattering discovery? Did you find Grandma's secret diary? Margaret placed the envelope on the table without opening it. I want to ask you all something first. When Harrison Reed bought those 6 pieces of furniture for $800, did any of you think that seemed low? Low? Linda laughed. Margaret, have you seen the prices at estate sales? People practically give things away just to empty out houses. $800 for a bunch of beat-up old furniture was generous. Beat up, Margaret repeated quietly. That's interesting. Because when I visited Reed's antique shop last week, that beat-up armoire was polished to perfection with a price tag of $4,000. The room went quiet. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, yeah, antique dealers restore things. That's how they make their profit. Buy low, fix up, sell high. $4,000 high. Margaret pulled out her laptop and connected it to Kevin's television. Let me show you something. The first image that appeared was the 2019 appraisal report. Margaret heard Linda's sharp intake of breath as the dollar amounts became visible on the large screen. Where did you get this? James demanded, his face pale. Dorothy's filing cabinet, the one we somehow forgot to check before having our fire sale. Margaret clicked to the next image, showing photographs of the writing desk from different decades. That, quote, typical Depression-era furniture Harrison Reed mentioned? It was actually crafted in 1847 by Pennsylvania German artisans. It's documented here in family letters dating back over a century. Linda was staring at the screen in horror. $45,000? That can't be right. It gets better, Margaret said, advancing to the armoire documentation. Remember that ugly old armoire from the attic? The one Reed said needed extensive restoration work? It was made by Heinrich Zimmermann, a Wisconsin craftsman whose pieces are featured in museums. Current estimated value, $62,000. Kevin's mouth hung open. But Reed said it was just common furniture. Reed lied. Margaret's voice was steady now, cold with purpose. He knew exactly what he was buying. No legitimate antique dealer looks at a Zimmermann armoire and mistakes it for mass-produced furniture. The joinery alone is distinctive enough to identify from across a room. She clicked through the remaining documentation, showing the appraised values of each piece Reed had purchased. The hand-carved music box, $8,000. The silver serving set, $12,000. The jewelry box made by Dorothy's father, $15,000, classified as exceptional folk art. The total value of everything Harrison Reed bought from us for $800, Margaret said, letting the silence stretch, is $237,000. James was the first to find his voice. This has to be illegal, fraud, or something. Fraud requires proving intent to deceive, Margaret replied. But there are other options. I've been researching consumer protection laws. Reed had a professional obligation to provide fair market value, especially when dealing with grieving families who clearly didn't understand what they were selling. Linda's face had gone ashen. What are you saying? I'm saying we have choices. Margaret closed her laptop and looked at each of her siblings in turn. We can approach Reed directly and demand fair compensation. We can file complaints with the state licensing board for antique dealers. We can pursue civil action for the difference between what we received and the actual value. He'll just claim he didn't know, Kevin protested weakly. Margaret smiled grimly. That's where Dorothy's documentation becomes crucial. She didn't just keep family stories. She kept provenance papers that any qualified appraiser would recognize. Reed's own expertise works against him. The more qualified he claims to be, the less believable his ignorance becomes. She pulled a business card from her purse. I've already spoken with Patricia Walsh, the attorney who handled Dorothy's estate. She's very interested in our situation. Apparently, this isn't the first time Reed's name has come up in connection with questionable estate purchases. Other families? Linda whispered. 3 that Walsh knows of personally. Elderly homeowners, recent deaths, families eager to liquidate quickly. Same pattern every time. Reed swoops in with cash offers for bulk lots of furniture that turn out to be worth 50 times what he paid. Margaret stood up, gathering her materials. I wanted to give you all the choice of how to handle this together, but with or without you, I'm not letting him keep what belongs to our family. What do you mean, with or without us? James asked nervously. Dorothy left detailed instructions in her will about how disputes over her estate should be handled. Since I'm the one who discovered the fraud, I have the right to pursue recovery on behalf of all beneficiaries. Your shares of any settlement would be distributed according to the original estate division. The room erupted in overlapping voices as her siblings realized the implications. They'd mocked Margaret for being too sentimental, too attached to worthless old furniture. Now their financial futures hung on her emotional connection to family history, the same connection that had led her to question Reed's dismissive assessment and search for Dorothy's hidden documentation. How long do we have to decide? Linda asked quietly. Walsh wants to move quickly before Reed has time to sell the pieces to private collectors. Once they're scattered to individual buyers, recovery becomes nearly impossible. Margaret headed toward the door. I'm meeting with her tomorrow morning to discuss our options. You have until then to decide if you want to be part of the solution or let me handle it alone. As she reached the door, Kevin called out, Margaret, wait. I'm sorry we laughed. We should have listened to you about keeping some of the furniture. Margaret turned back, her expression softer now. Kevin, you were right about one thing. Dorothy wouldn't have wanted us fighting over possessions. But she also wouldn't have wanted us to be cheated out of our inheritance by someone who took advantage of our grief. Sometimes protecting what matters requires fighting for it. 2 days later, Harrison Reed's attorney called Walsh to discuss a settlement. By the end of the week, Reed and Associates had quietly transferred ownership of all 6 pieces back to the Stevens family, along with a substantial cash payment to cover legal fees and damages. Margaret had the writing desk restored to its original condition and placed it in her apartment, where she used it every morning to write in her own journal, just as Dorothy had done. The other pieces were sold through a reputable auction house, netting the family nearly $300,000, enough to change all their lives. The best part, Margaret thought as she sat at Dorothy's writing desk watching the sunrise through her window, was that her grandmother had orchestrated the entire thing from beyond the grave. Dorothy had kept those records for a reason, hidden them where only someone who truly loved the family history would think to look. She'd known exactly what would happen, and she'd trusted Margaret to set things right. The old furniture wasn't just valuable after all. It was priceless, because it connected them to something more important than money, the truth about who they were and where they came from. The settlement negotiations took place in Patricia Walsh's downtown law office on a gray October morning. Margaret arrived early, clutching the folder of documentation that had become her constant companion over the past month. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind racing through all the ways Harrison Reed might try to wriggle out of accountability. Walsh greeted her with the confident smile of an attorney who knew she held all the winning cards. Reed's lawyer called twice yesterday trying to negotiate terms before we even started. That tells me they know exactly how bad this looks for their client. When Reed arrived with his attorney, a nervous-looking man named Clifford Barnes, Margaret was struck by how different the antique dealer appeared outside his elegant showroom. Gone was the polished confidence she'd encountered during her visit to his shop. Instead, Reed fidgeted with his cufflinks and avoided making eye contact with anyone in the room. Barnes opened the meeting by attempting to frame the situation as a simple misunderstanding. My client operates in good faith within industry standards. Estate sales are inherently unpredictable, and buyers assume certain risks when making bulk purchases of unverified items. Walsh interrupted with a laugh that held no warmth. Unverified? Mr. Reed is a certified appraiser with 30 years of experience in American furniture. Are you seriously arguing that he couldn't identify the distinctive construction techniques of Pennsylvania German craftsmanship? She slid a folder across the table to Barnes. This contains photographic evidence from Mr. Reed's own shop, showing the Stevens family armoire displayed with detailed provenance information that matches exactly what was documented in Mrs. Dorothy Stevens' records. Your client not only knew what he was buying, he was prepared to market it appropriately within days of the purchase. Reed spoke for the first time, his voice strained. The furniture required significant restoration work. The risks involved in that process justify the purchase price differential. Margaret found her voice, surprising herself with its steadiness. Mr. Reed, when I visited your shop, you told me the armoire needed only minor wood conditioning. Now you're claiming significant restoration was required. Which version is true? Barnes shot his client a warning look, but the damage was done. Reed's inconsistent statements were now part of the official record. Walsh pressed her advantage. We've also discovered that this isn't an isolated incident. 3 other families have come forward with similar experiences involving your client's estate purchases. Mrs. Henderson in Millfield sold your client a shaker dining set for $600 that appeared in his showroom the following week, priced at $18,000. The Morrison family in Riverside accepted $400 for what they were told was typical Victorian parlor furniture that was later identified as pieces from the workshop of John Henry Belter, worth approximately $40,000. Reed's face had gone pale. Barnes fumbled through his briefcase, clearly unprepared for the scope of evidence Walsh had assembled. Furthermore, Walsh continued, we've documented a pattern of your client specifically targeting estate sales held by grieving families within 6 months of a death. He arrives early, makes bulk cash offers before families have time to research values, and consistently underrepresents his own expertise when questioned about specific pieces. Margaret watched Reed's composure crumble as Walsh methodically dismantled his defense. The man who had been so dismissive of her family's stories now looked small and defeated. Barnes attempted one last deflection. Even if there were appraisal discrepancies, the families voluntarily agreed to the sales. There was no coercion involved. No coercion? Margaret's voice rose, despite her efforts to stay calm. Your client presented himself as an expert, while simultaneously claiming ignorance about the very pieces his expertise should have immediately identified. He exploited our grief and our trust. If that's not coercion, what would you call it? Walsh nodded approvingly. What Ms. Stevens is describing is textbook consumer fraud. Your client used his professional credentials to gain trust, then deliberately misrepresented the value of items he was purchasing. The fact that he was prepared to accurately market these same pieces immediately after purchase proves he knew their true worth all along. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Barnes shuffling through papers, clearly searching for some argument that might save his client from complete disaster. Reed finally broke. I'll return the pieces, he said quietly. All of them. And I'll cover any legal expenses. That's a start, Walsh replied smoothly. But it doesn't address the damages caused by your deceptive practices. The Stevens family has suffered financial harm, emotional distress, and the temporary loss of irreplaceable family heirlooms. They're entitled to compensation beyond simple restitution. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched the man who had so casually dismissed her grandmother's treasures squirm in his expensive suit. But more than revenge, she felt vindicated. Every instinct that had told her something was wrong, every doubt her siblings had mocked, every sleepless night spent wondering if she was being overly sentimental, all of it had been justified. Barnes whispered urgently with his client before addressing the room again. My client is prepared to offer full restitution of the furniture, plus $50,000 in additional compensation, contingent on a signed non-disclosure agreement. $100,000, Walsh countered immediately, and no non-disclosure agreement. Your client's business practices are a matter of public interest. Margaret watched Reed's shoulders sag in defeat. The man who had built his reputation on exploiting families' ignorance about their own treasures was finally facing consequences for his actions. And there's one more condition, Margaret added, her voice gaining strength. Mr. Reed needs to personally contact every family he's purchased from in the past 5 years and offer them the opportunity to have their items reappraised by an independent expert. If any discrepancies are found, he needs to make full restitution. Reed looked up at her with something like respect. You're not content with just getting your family's money back. No, Margaret replied firmly. I'm not. Because this isn't just about money. It's about trust and integrity and respecting people when they're at their most vulnerable. My grandmother spent 70 years caring for those pieces, documenting their history, preserving their stories. You saw dollar signs, where she saw family legacy. That's what I can't forgive. By noon, the settlement was signed. Reed agreed to return all 6 pieces of furniture, pay $100,000 in damages, and establish a fund to compensate other families who could prove similar exploitation. Most importantly to Margaret, he agreed to a formal apology acknowledging his professional misconduct. As Margaret walked out of Walsh's office with the signed agreement in her hands, she felt her grandmother's presence more strongly than she had since the funeral. Dorothy had trusted her to preserve what mattered, to fight for what was right, and to ensure that their family's treasures would be treated with the respect they deserved. The writing desk was delivered to Margaret's apartment the following week, professionally restored to its original 1847 condition. As she sat down to write the first entry in what she decided would become her own journal of family stories, she could almost hear Dorothy's approving laughter echoing through the generations. 6 months after the settlement, Margaret stood in the restored parlor of Dorothy's Victorian home, now officially hers, thanks to the money recovered from Harrison Reed. The house had been taken off the market when Margaret realized she could afford to keep it, and she'd spent the winter carefully bringing it back to life while honoring its original character. The writing desk sat in its traditional spot by the front window, where Dorothy had placed it decades ago to catch the morning light. Margaret had arranged the other recovered pieces throughout the house according to old photographs she'd found in Dorothy's albums, recreating the warm, lived-in feeling that had made the house feel like home for so many generations. Her siblings had been transformed by the experience in ways Margaret hadn't expected. Linda, once so practical and dismissive of sentiment, had become fascinated by the family's history. She'd taken over the project of digitizing Dorothy's extensive photograph collection and had discovered a talent for genealogical research that surprised everyone, including herself. I found another letter, Linda announced, arriving for their weekly family dinner with a manila envelope tucked under her arm. This one's from 1923, and it mentions a clock that great-grandmother brought from Germany. I think it might be the mantel clock that disappeared years ago. Kevin had channeled his guilt over the estate sale into something productive, volunteering with a non-profit that helped elderly homeowners document and protect valuable family heirlooms. You wouldn't believe how many people have no idea what they own, he told Margaret as he helped her arrange fresh flowers in Dorothy's crystal vases. Last week, I helped a widow discover that her husband's tool collection included hand-forged implements from the 1800s worth more than their house. James had perhaps changed the most dramatically. The brother who had once been obsessed with quick profits now spent his free time learning traditional woodworking techniques, determined to create heirloom-quality pieces for his own children. I want them to have something made with love, he explained, showing Margaret the jewelry box he was carving for his daughter's 16th birthday. Something with a story they'll want to preserve. The recovery of the furniture had attracted attention beyond their family. Patricia Walsh had used their case as the foundation for new legislation requiring antique dealers to provide written appraisals for any estate purchase exceeding $500. 3 other states had already adopted similar laws, creating protections for grieving families who might otherwise fall victim to predatory practices. Margaret had been invited to speak at estate planning seminars, sharing Dorothy's story and encouraging people to document their possessions while they were still able to do so. Your grandmother was brilliant, one elderly man told her after a presentation in Burlington. She knew that knowledge dies with us unless we write it down. My wife kept meaning to tell our children about her mother's china set, but she passed suddenly, and now we have no idea which pieces are valuable and which are just pretty dishes. Harrison Reed's antique business had quietly closed 3 months after the settlement. The investigation triggered by Margaret's case had revealed a pattern of exploitation spanning over a decade, involving dozens of families who had unknowingly sold valuable pieces for fractions of their worth. The state licensing board had revoked his certification, And he'd relocated to another state where his reputation hadn't yet caught up with him. But the most meaningful change had been in Margaret herself. The timid librarian who had once apologized for taking up space in her own family had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She'd become the family's unofficial historian, the keeper of stories, and the guardian of memory. Dorothy's garden had flourished under Margaret's care, producing vegetables and flowers that fed both body and soul. She'd expanded the herbs section, planting varieties mentioned in her great-great-grandmother's recipe collection, creating a living connection to generations of women who had tended this same soil. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sit at the writing desk with Dorothy's journals spread before her, adding her own entries to the family record. She wrote about the legal battle, about her siblings' transformations, about the satisfaction of seeing justice served, and family treasures restored to their rightful place. But mostly, she wrote about love. The love that had motivated Dorothy to preserve every receipt and photograph, the love that had guided Margaret to question what others accepted without thought, and the love that now filled every room of the old house with warmth and purpose. The doorbell rang as Margaret was finishing her evening writing session. She opened the door to find Mrs. Chen holding a covered dish and wearing the smile of a woman bearing good news. "I brought soup," the elderly woman announced, "and I have something to show you." She pulled a small wooden box from her purse. "I found this in my attic last weekend. I think it belonged to your grandmother, from back when we were both young mothers and used to trade recipes." Margaret opened the box to find it filled with handwritten recipe cards in Dorothy's familiar script, along with a note dated just 2 years ago. "For Emma, when she's ready to carry on the family traditions. Love always, Grandma Dorothy." As Margaret read the note, she realized that Dorothy's gifts were still revealing themselves, still teaching lessons about the value of preservation and the power of documentation. The old woman had understood something that her own children had missed, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the stories we keep alive and the love we pass down through generations. That night, Margaret added one final entry to her journal. "Today I understand what Grandma Dorothy knew all along. The furniture was never really about the money. It was about remembering who we are and where we came from. It was about having the courage to fight for what matters, even when others can't see its value. Most of all, it was about love. The kind of love that builds something beautiful and then trusts the next generation to protect it." She closed the journal and placed it in the writing desk's bottom drawer, next to Dorothy's collection, ensuring that future generations would have the full story. Somewhere in the quiet house, she could swear she heard the sound of gentle laughter, warm and knowing, like a grandmother's approval carried on the evening breeze. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.